Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech, and this is deck number 166, and it's titled ETB, or Enter the Boros. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card was suggested to us by the Devonshire Mint over on YouTube, and that card is Duke Ulder Ravengard. And Duke Ulder Ravengard is 4 red-white for a 5/5 legendary creature human noble soldier. At the beginning of combat on your turn, another target creature you control gains haste and Myriad until the end of turn. So a very simple ability, but there's a lot of different ways we can build around this, and as always, if we have a legendary creature as our random card of the week, that means of course that it's going to be our commander because that is the best way to build around it. So without spending too much time talking about the commander themselves, let's jump into some of our themes for this deck and take a look at what we're really trying to do. So the first major theme for this deck is going to be creatures with enter the battlefield effects. Because of the way that Myriad works and we create 2 token copies of a creature, that means that we will have 2 copies of that creature entering the battlefield, triggering any enter the battlefield effects that we have. So for example, Priest of Ancient Lore is 2 and a white for a 2/1 dwarf cleric. When it enters the battlefield, you gain a life and draw a card. So nice, simple, clean. But what that means is we can play this as its own card, draw a card, gain a life, and then when we give it Myriad, we can attack and make 3 more additional copies because we'll hopefully have 3 opponents, meaning we're going to draw an additional 3 cards and gain an additional 3 life, which is going to be a great way to kind of promote the card draw synergies in our deck. Boros traditionally not the best at drawing cards, so we really want to lean into finding ways to do it through combat and through enter the battlefield effects. Now, with that being in mind, let's move on to our second theme, which is going to be creatures that sacrifice themselves. So in a very similar vein to enter the battlefield, we also have creatures that can do something to sacrifice themselves or gain some amount of value, because if we're making additional token copies, we don't necessarily always need them all to deal damage. So for example, we have Remorseful Cleric, which is 1 and a white for a 2/1 spirit cleric. It is flying, and we can sacrifice it to exile all cards from target player's graveyard. Since our tokens are going to be going away at the end of combat anyway, we might as well find ways to get some use out of them. So if we attack with Remorseful Cleric, we Myriad, we get 2 more tokens. We're going to be able to all of a sudden exile 2 players' graveyards, which is going to be incredibly relevant. It's also worth mentioning, I think I might have said my math wrong, we won't make 3 tokens if we have 3 opponents, we will instead just make 2. So if I made a mistake at any point, I do apologize. I know it's just the difference between 2 and 3, but numbers are not my strong suit, so you get what I'm trying to say. So Remorseful Cleric is a great way to remove graveyards, and it's a great repeatable way to remove graveyards, because as long as we can attack with it every turn with Myriad, we can essentially keep any graveyard player's graveyard completely empty every time we go around the table. And this isn't the only effect we have that sacrifices. We have plenty that do very similar things, and that is one of the other ways we're going to try to accrue value in this deck. And then, last but not least, our final theme is a little bit weird, but I wanted to try it out in this deck, and that is 7 dwarves. So 7 of our 100 card slots are dedicated to 7 dwarves, because it is 1 and a red for a 2/2 dwarf. 7 dwarves gets +1/+1 for each other creature named 7 dwarves that you control, and a deck can have up to 7 cards named 7 dwarves. So worst case scenario, if we just have 1, it's just a 2-mana 2/2, but if we give it Myriad and we attack an opponent, we make 2 more copies of it that are also named 7 dwarves, so now each of our opponents has a 4/4 that is attacking them instead of a 2/2. And best case scenario, we can actually get all 7 in play, making them just naturally 8 power creatures, give one of them Myriad, and then we add 2 more to that, meaning that they're all 10/10 creatures, and we're attacking with a huge board, kind of, well, I would say out of nowhere, but I imagine our opponents probably see this coming. But there's not a ton of decks that can really take advantage of 7 dwarves, and I felt that this was a deck that could, so I wanted to try it out. Let me know down in the comments if you think 7 dwarves are good in this deck, or maybe there's another deck that they're even better in. I would love to hear it, because I'm always trying to find a place for this card, and I can never quite make it work, so let me know what you think. But other than that, of course, we're going to move on from our themes. That is what our deck is trying to do. So now we're going to talk about some of our key cards. These are the cards that really synergize with what we're trying to do and are a great way to accrue value or maybe our win conditions in their own right. So the first of our key cards that I want to highlight is Warstorm Surge. Since we are making a not overwhelming amount of tokens, most likely with Myriad we're making 2 tokens every single turn, cards like Impact Tremors that do damage to each opponent every time a creature enters is fine, but it's only doing 1 damage. Warstorm Surge is 5 and a red for an enchantment that says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. So if we are making token copies of, say if we use our 7 dwarves example, we make 10/10 dwarves, we have 2 10/10s entering the battlefield. That means we can immediately do 10 damage twice to any targets, meaning that we could just do 20 damage to an opponent and just knock them out right there. So Warstorm Surge is incredibly important because a lot of our creatures do have pretty high power. We want to make sure that we are doing the most damage possible every single time we attack, and this is also a great way to win the game. If for some reason combat gets shut down, if we're unable to attack, we can still cast our creatures and still take people out of the game that way. So that is keycard number 1. And keycard number 2 is going to be Mere Battlesphere. So Mere Battlesphere is probably the number 1 creature that we want to be making copies of with Myriad because it has some incredibly unique and very powerful synergies that come into play when there are multiple copies of it. So to give you an example of what we're trying to do, Mere Battlesphere is 7 mana for a 4/7 artifact creature mirror construct. When it enters the battlefield, create 4 1/1 colorless mirror artifact creature tokens, and whenever it attacks, you may tap X untapped mirror you control. If you do, it gets +X/+O until the end of turn, and deals X damage to the player or planeswalker that it's attacking. Now, I may have people correct me on this, so please do correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the way that you can stack your triggers with Mere Battlesphere is if you give it Myriad, you attack, you make 2 more Mere Battlespheres, which both make 4 1/1 mirrors. You now have a grand total of 12 untapped mirrors. You can then trigger the Mere Battlesphere that's attacking the original one and tap all 12 of them to give it +12/+0 and do 12 damage to whoever it's attacking. Now, like I said, I believe you can stack the triggers like that. If I am wrong, please do let me know. But either way, we still wind up with 12 mirrors, even if we don't do the 12 damage. So I do think Mere Battlesphere is almost an instant army type of card. It's a great way to just attack and get just a huge amount of value out of it. And then once we have all those tokens, we can keep doing this every single turn, make more mirror, make more damage, and just really do what the Battlesphere is implying and kind of snowball out of control. So that is key card number 2 and one of my personal favorite cards in the deck. But moving on to the last key card, which is all in all like the best card in this deck, and I don't really want to have an argument over that one, but it is. So let's be real. It is Agris Kos Eternal Soldier. That is 3 and a white for a 3/4 legendary creature spirit soldier. It has vigilance. Whenever it becomes the target of an ability that targets only it, you may pay 1 and a red or a white. If you do, copy that ability for each other creature you control that ability could target, and each copy targets a different one of those creatures. So having Duke Ulder Ravengard target Agris Kos with his ability to give him Myriad and Haste means that we can now copy it for 2 mana, and every single one of our creatures gets Myriad and Haste until the end of turn. And yes, Agris Kos is a legendary creature, so when he attacks, his other 2 token copies will just have to go away because they're legendary and can't stay on the board. But that is a small price to pay when we can then have him and the Mirror Battlesphere and all of our card draw and all of our token generators and all of our damage dealers all make multiple tokens, which all then trigger things like Warstorm Surge, and we're gaining life and drawing cards and doing damage and knocking people out in combat. And Agris Koss really just takes this deck and turns it into overdrive. Because even if he's not in play, you have to remember that being able to give haste and Myriad with Duke Ulder Ravengard means that we just have to play him, give him haste and Myriad, and it applies to the entire board. So we can really do this out of nowhere. Our opponents might think they're relatively safe. There's only one creature on our board that's going to get haste and Myriad, and then all of a sudden it becomes everything. So every single player is trying to defend against every single creature we control, and that is where things can really get out of hand. So like I said, I am sure there are arguments to be made about other cards in the deck being the most important key card. However, I will fully throw my support behind Agris Koss in this case because I think it really just does so much for the deck. It's wild. I can't even put a lot of it into words. It's very, very impressive. So with all of that being said, and before I ramble on too much about Agris Koss, let's move on to some of the cool interactions in the deck, some of the ways that some cards synergize together, and some cards that I just like to highlight because, well, I think they're kind of cool. So the first cool interaction that we're going to talk about is between Voldaren Thrillseeker and Sun Titan. So Voldaren Thrillseeker, 2 and a red for a 1/1 vampire warrior. It's got backup 2, and you can pay 1 and sacrifice this creature, and it deals damage equal to its power to any target. Now, one of the nice things about Myriad and all of our other creatures is that Myriad forces us to exile the creatures at the end of combat, which is a point when they've already done combat damage. So if we attack with Voldaren Thrillseeker, we back up 2 when the other 2 come in on themselves, so they are 3/3s, they do 3 damage to that opponent. We still get a chance to sacrifice them after they've done their damage, but before they're exiled, meaning that they can technically be doing 6 damage in general. Now, another thing that we're going to do is be able to sacrifice the original Voldaren Thrillseeker and get it back with Sun Titan, because Sun Titan is 4 white for a 6/6 giant. It's got vigilance. Whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you may return target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So we can use the Thrillseeker to sacrifice itself, do some damage to anything we might need to do damage to, and then Sun Titan can bring it back since it has a mana value of 3 or less. And this is a great way to just kind of churn out a ton of damage and get to a point where nothing our opponents control are safe, because we can do that damage to them, to their planeswalkers, to their creatures. It really doesn't matter. So if there's ever anything in the way or anything that could kill Sun Titan or kill the Thrillseeker, we can just get it out of the way and then bring it back with Sun Titan. So this is a great value piece. It may not necessarily win the game on its own, but I think over the course of enough turns, it definitely could. So that is cool interaction number 1. And moving on to cool interaction number 2, this one is between Karmic Guide and Selfless Spirit. So Karmic Guide is 3 white for a 2/2 Angel Spirit, has flying and protection from black, and it has Echo, 3 white, so we do have to pay 5 mana in our upkeep after we play it, otherwise we have to sacrifice it. But the most important part is when it enters the battlefield, we return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. And since we have so many creatures that sacrifice themselves, there's plenty of targets for this in the deck, but I think the most important one is Selfless Spirit, which is 1 and a white for a Spirit Cleric. It's a 2/1, it's got flying, and you can sacrifice it to give creatures you control indestructible until the end of turn. So this is a great way to protect from board wipes. It's a great way to protect if you're blocking and someone's attacking you with all their stuff, or if we attack and we want to protect everything. Selfless Spirit keeps everything alive, and then Karmic Guide can actually just get it back at the beginning of whatever turn we play it. So now we have multiple turns of Selfless Spirit protecting our entire board, and so our opponents are going to need at least 3 Destroy Wraths. If they have an Exile Wrath, then we're kind of just out of luck, but we're just banking on them not having those things. But either way, being able to protect everything multiple times is incredibly powerful, and it's a great way to make sure that whatever we're doing, there's nothing our opponents can really do to stop us. So I think that's why these two cards deserve a spot in our cool interactions. Now, with all of that being said, though, we're going to move ahead to the final piece of our deck tech, which is the budget of this deck. And so this week, our total deck price came in at $70.67, with the most expensive card being Chivalric Alliance at $7.69. Now, I've tried to put Chivalric Alliance into a lot of decks that I've made, and the price just keeps going up. So if you are looking to get a copy of it, I would recommend it. I don't think it's going to go down in price anytime soon, but it's incredibly powerful for mono white or Boros decks because it is 1 and a white for an enchantment. Whenever you attack with 2 or more creatures, draw a card, and you can pay 2 and discard a card to make a 2/2 white and blue knight creature token with vigilance. So it's a great way to benefit from attacking. You draw cards, and we're pretty much always going to be attacking with 2 or more creatures just because of the nature of the deck. It is worth noting that Myriad itself will not trigger Chivalric Alliance because we attack and then we make the tokens. So you have to attack with 2 actual creatures and not bank on the Myriad triggers. But it's also a discard outlet in case we get flooded. Maybe we get too many lands or cards we don't really want. We can turn them into creatures, which then triggers more card draw, and we can kind of keep the train rolling that way. Now, obviously, if you do need to cut this card for budget purposes, you certainly can. As weird as it is, I might actually recommend that you cut it for budget purposes, because while it is very strong, we have so much card draw in this deck, which is not something you typically hear from a Boros deck, but there are so many creatures that draw cards when they enter. We've got so many artifacts that draw cards. We've got so many ways to trigger Myriad to get our ETBs again and draw more cards that we're almost never hurting for the card draw. And this doesn't actually feel like it does quite enough. Drawing 1 card when we attack instead of drawing maybe 2 or even 3 sometimes is kind of underpowered, which feels very strange to say about this card because it is very strong. But I don't think this is the deck that's hurting for card draw. So if you do need to trim for budget purposes, you can cut out Chivalric Alliance. There's actually some ETB draw card creatures that I did not include in this deck because there were just so many options. So there are, of course, some replacements you can make to it if you need to. But with that being said, I do also have a suggestion for an out-of-budget upgrade. So if you have a card that you want to put in that's a little bit out of budget and you're wondering what that may be, I have a suggestion for you. And this week, the card I would recommend putting in would be Terror of the Peaks. And of course, if you're putting a card in, you have to take a card out, which I would recommend being Errand Rider of Gondor. So starting off with Terror of the Peaks, this is 3 red for a 5/4 dragon. It's got flying. Spells your opponents cast that target Terror of the Peaks cost an additional 3 life to cast, and whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Terror of the Peaks deals damage equal to that creature's power to any target. So I think you can immediately see why this is going to be incredibly powerful, because it's essentially just another copy of Warstorm Surge, which we put in our key cards section, so you can tell it's very good. But even more so than that, it's a creature that you can give Myriad. And if we have Myriad on Terror of the Peaks, and we attack and we make 2 more token copies, both of those copies will see each other enter, and the original will see them enter as well, meaning that the original is going to deal out 10 damage, and the other 2 are going to deal out 5, so that's dealing 20 damage just on attacks, before we even get to the combat damage, before we worry about things like Warstorm Surge, before we worry about anything else. We are then able to do a ton of damage. Plus, even if we don't Myriad the Terror of the Peaks and we Myriad something else, they're still all coming in, still all triggering Terror of the Peaks, and still doing a ton of damage. So I really can't talk about how good this card is enough, because it definitely deserves a spot in the deck if you're able to squeeze it in. It is unfortunately almost $20 though, so it is a very difficult card to squeeze in. But like I mentioned, if you're putting a card in, you would have to take a card out, and that card would be Errand Rider of Gondor, which is 2 and a white for a 3/2 human soldier. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card. Then if you don't control a legendary creature, put a card from your hand on the bottom of your library. Now, due to the nature of this deck, we don't actually have that many legendary creatures because we wanted to make sure most of our creatures could be targeted with Myriad, and so we really only have Agris Koss and Duke Ulder Ravengard. And while that's not terrible, this isn't exactly a card that we want to wait to cast until we have our commander in play. We would much rather cast it early on and then get the card draw from it and Myriad it later. But because we would have to discard a card, or I guess put the card on the bottom of our library, which in some cases is actually worse for us, we don't really want this when we have so many other card draw effects available to us. So if you have the budget and can replace this 1 cent card with a $17 card, then I would highly recommend it. But if you don't have the budget for it, I completely understand. Obviously, this is why we build the decks under $100, and Errand Rider of Gondor still does pretty well, and it still benefits from the Myriad because once the Duke is in play, it does just draw cards. But it's nice to have it available beginning and late game, and we don't really want to be putting cards on the bottom of our library. So with that being said, that is our budget section for this week. And before we get into the game, because of course we gotta play a game with this deck and see how it does, I want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. So as always, a huge shout out to all of our patrons and channel members, such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Way, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, Paddywhack, Richard, Devin Purser, and Brian Haney. So to all of you, thank you all so much. And I know I'm reading out a longer list almost every time, so at some point we'll have to figure out what to do if this list gets too long, but thank you all so much for all of your support. And if you would like to join the amazing people listed below, you can head on over to patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide or join us right here on YouTube as a channel member where you get access to things like the deck lists a week early. You get access to a Discord channel where we brew up a lot of the decks and also play the games that appear in these videos. You could get a random card sent to you every single month as a thank you. It will be one of the cards we've built around that month. You also get the unedited gameplay videos, and in my opinion, the most important part of this is the guarantee from me that any of the cards you suggest for this channel will get turned into videos eventually. It might take me a while, but I will definitely get there. For everybody else who's not a patron or channel member, please do continue to suggest cards. I do my best to get through everybody's, so that's not to say that I can't get to yours. I will, of course, do my best. But if none of that sounds appealing to you, or maybe it's just not the right time, I completely understand. You can always just like this video and subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit. So thank you all so much. I really can't thank you enough, but thank you anyway. So let's move on to our gameplay and see how this deck actually performs when we test it out against some opponents. So this week we are being joined by 3 opponents. In this case, Dr. Madison Lee being played by Cole, Multani Morrow Sorcerer being played by Luke, and the 13th Doctor and Yasmin Khan being played by Richard. So starting off with Cole's Dr. Madison Lee deck, this is pretty much exactly what it looks like. This is an energy deck. He wants to cast a bunch of artifacts, he wants to make a bunch of energy, he wants to spend that energy to reanimate artifacts and draw cards and give haste, and just kind of do a bunch of shenanigans related to energy. And I'm very excited to see how this goes. Personally, I have a Sultai energy deck, and so I'm not quite sure what Jeskai brings to the table, but I'm very excited to see how it turns out. Next up, we have Luke and his Multani deck. This deck has shown up multiple times on the channel before, sometimes with a different commander, but he has gone back to Multani Morrow Sorcerer because the Shroud, while sometimes a hindrance, is more often than not a great way to prevent removal. So Luke really just wants to have the entire table draw as many cards as possible, so Multani is just a one-shot no matter who he's attacking, and it's a great way to play a form of group hug while also playing a form of Voltron, so it's definitely a unique take on mono green, and every time this deck shows up it puts in a ton of work, so I'm very excited to see how it goes. And then last but not least, we have Richard playing the 13th Doctor and Yasmin Khan. This is another deck that has shown up on the channel before, and believe it or not, it's a deck that won on the channel before, but in Richard's own words, he wanted to add some actual win conditions to it. So I imagine that means that this deck has been powered up just a little bit. So he's got the 13th Doctor to care about casting things from anywhere other than his hand. He's got Yasmin Khan to exile the top card of his library so he can play it. So it's really just casting things from exile, casting things from the top of his library, and making sure that no matter what he's doing, he's just accruing a ton of value. So I think out of all of the decks at the table, that is the one that I am the most concerned about, just because, like I said, I've lost to this deck before, and he mentioned he's made it even better. So definitely something to look out for. But let me know down in the comments which deck you think is going to walk away with the victory, ours included, because, you know, we've always got a chance. So let me know what you think, get your predictions in for the game, and then we're going to jump into it, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, I go first, followed by Cole, Luke, and then Richard. On my first turn, I play a Desert of the True. Cole plays a Temple of Epiphany, scrying 1. Luke plays a Forest. Richard plays a Command Tower. I play a Mountain and cast 7 Dwarves, which gets +1/+1 for each other 7 Dwarves that I control. Cole plays a Sundown Pass and then casts a Soul Ring. Luke plays a Forest and casts Anvil of Bogarden, giving each player no maximum hand size and letting everyone draw an additional card in their draw step, but also making them discard a card. On Richard's turn, he draws an additional card and then discards a card, plays a Forest, and casts Farseek, searching his library for a Steam Vents, putting it into play tapped. On my turn, I draw an additional card and discard a card, then I cast my own Soul Ring and cast another 7 Dwarves. After that, I play a Boros Garrison, returning a Mountain to my hand, and I move to combat, attacking Cole for 3 with the 7 Dwarves. On Cole's turn, he draws 2 and discards a card, then plays an island and casts his commander, Dr. Madison Lee, letting him get an energy whenever he casts an artifact, and she can also tap to pay 1 energy, giving a creature +1/+0, haste and trample until the end of turn, pay 3 energy to draw a card, or pay 5 energy to return an artifact from his graveyard to the battlefield. On Luke's turn, he draws 2 and discards a card, then plays a Slippery Karst. On Richard's turn, he draws 2 and discards a card, then casts Courser of Crufix, making him play with the top of his library revealed, letting him play lands from the top of his library, and letting him gain a life whenever a land enters under his control. He then plays a Dream Root Cascade, gaining a life. On my turn, I draw 2 and discard a card, play a Mountain, and cast Solemn Simulacrum, searching my library for a basic land and putting it into play tapped. After that, I move to combat and attack Richard for 6 with the 2 7 Dwarves, and he blocks 1 with the Courser, taking only 3. Then, in my second main phase, I cast a Charming Prince, exiling Solemn Simulacrum when it enters, and returning it to play at the beginning of the next end step, allowing me to immediately return it when I move to my end step, and search my library for another basic land, putting it into play tapped. On Cole's turn, he draws 2 cards and discards a card, then plays a Myriad Landscape and casts Mystic Forge, letting him look at that top card of his library and cast it if it's an artifact or colorless spell. Then he can also pay a life and tap it to exile the top card of his library. This also gets him an energy with Dr. Lee. On Luke's turn, he draws 2 and discards a card, then plays a Forest and casts Karametra's Acolyte, which can tap for mana equal to his devotion to green. On Richard's turn, he draws 2 cards and then discards a card, then plays a Mountain, gaining a life with the Courser of Crufix, and casts his commander Yasmin Khan, which can tap to exile the top card of his library, letting him play it until the end of his next turn. On my turn, I draw 2 cards and discard a card, then I play a Plains and cast Inspiring Overseer, drawing a card and gaining a life. Then I cast my commander Duke Ulder Ravengard, letting me give target creature haste and Myriad when I move to combat, which I do, targeting Inspiring Overseer. This allows me to attack Luke with it for 2, creating a token copy that's tapped and attacking each other opponent, letting me draw 2 additional cards and gain 2 more life. Then all my opponents take 2 and I exile the tokens at the end of combat. On Cole's turn, he draws 2 cards and discards a card, then casts Aethertide Whale, getting 6 energy when it enters, and letting him pay 4 energy to return it to his hand. On Luke's turn, he draws 2 and discards a card, then plays a Desert of the Indomitable and casts Throne of Eldraine, choosing green so that it taps for 4 green mana, and allows Luke to pay 3 and tap it to draw 2 cards. This lets him cast Lignify, enchanting Duke Ravengard, turning him into a 0/4 Treefolk with no abilities. On Richard's turn, he draws 2 cards and discards a card, then activates Yasmin, exiling Memory Worm from the top of his library. After that, he plays a Temple of Epiphany, scrying 1 and gaining a life, before casting his commander, the 13th Doctor, letting him put a +1/+1 counter on a creature when he casts a spell from anywhere other than his hand, and also untapping all his creatures with +1/+1 counters on them in his end step. After that, he casts Memory Worm from exile, putting a counter on Yasmin, and also letting him do 2 damage to a player when he casts a spell from anywhere other than his hand, making that player discard a card, draw a card, and putting a +1/+1 counter on the worm. At the end of turn, he untaps Yasmin with the 13th Doctor's ability. On my turn, I draw 2 cards and discard a card, then play a Myriad Landscape and cast a Boros Signet. I also cast a Captain of the Watch, making 3 1/1 soldier tokens when it enters, and giving all my other soldiers +1/+1 in Vigilance. I also cast a Selfless Savior, which can sacrifice itself to give another target creature indestructible until the end of turn, and I move to combat, attacking Richard for 2 with Inspiring Overseer. At the end of turn, Cole pays 5 energy with Dr. Lee, returning Archaeomancer's map from his graveyard to the battlefield, letting him search his library for 2 basic planes, putting them to hand, and then letting him put a land into play from his hand whenever an opponent plays a land if that opponent controls more lands than he does. On Cole's turn, he draws 2 and discards a card, then plays a plains and casts Brotherhood Vertibird, which has power equal to the number of artifacts he controls and has a crew cost of 2. This also gets him another energy, and after that, he casts T45 Power Armor, getting 3 more energy, and moves to combat, attacking me for 6 with the Whale. On Luke's turn, he draws 2 and then discards a card, plays a forest, and casts his commander Multani Maro Sorcerer, which has Shroud, and has power and toughness currently equal to the number of cards in all players' hand. He casts Zenith Chronicler as well, so whenever a player casts a multicolored spell, each of that player's opponents draw a card. At the end of turn, Richard activates Yasmin to exile Chord of Calling from the top of his library. On Richard's turn, he draws 2 cards and then discards a card, and activates Yasmin again, exiling Magus of the Future from the top of his library. He then plays an island from the top of his library, gaining a life, and casts the Magus of the Future from exile, having him play with the top card of his library revealed, and letting him cast the top card of his library. This also has him putting a +1/+1 counter on the Courser of Krufix, a +1/+1 counter on Memory Worm, doing 2 damage to himself so he can discard a card and then draw a card. After that, he cast an Elvish Mystic from the top of his library, putting a counter on the Magus and a counter on Memory Worm, doing 2 more to himself so he can discard a card and draw a card. After that, Richard cast Chord of Calling for X = 3 from exile, putting a +1/+1 counter on the 13th Doctor, Memory Worm, doing 2 damage to Luke, letting him discard a card, draw a card, and then searching his library for a creature with mana value 3 or less, in this case, Kami of Whispered Hopes, putting it into play and putting an additional counter on all his creatures whenever they get a counter. Finally, at the end of turn, Richard untaps all of his creatures that have +1/+1 counters. On my turn, I draw 2 and then discard a card, and then I cast Coveted Jewel, drawing 3 cards when it enters and letting any player gain control of it, untap it, and draw 3 cards when they attack me with an unblocked creature. After that, I cast Agros Kos, Eternal Soldier, letting me pay 2 mana whenever he becomes the target of an ability that targets only him, to copy it for each other creature I control. I also cast a Commander Sphere, and then move to combat, attacking Richard for 2 with Inspiring Overseer. At the end of turn, Cole pays 3 energy to draw a card with Dr. Lee. On Cole's turn, he draws 2 cards and discards a card, then plays a Mystic Monastery and equips the Whale with the T45 Power Armor, giving it +3/+3 and not untapping it in his untap step unless he pays an energy, also giving it either a lifelink, trample, or menace counter when it untaps. He moves to combat, attacking me for 9 with the Whale, gaining control of the Coveted Jewel, untapping it, and drawing 3 cards. In his second main phase, Cole casts a Soltron Dominator, getting 3 energy when it enters, and letting him pay an energy when an artifact creature he controls attacks to give it a +1/+1, first strike, or trample counter. He also cast Electrostatic Pummeler, getting 4 more energy and letting him pay 3 energy to double the Pummeler's power and toughness until the end of turn. On Luke's turn, he draws 2 cards and discards a card, plays a Miko Koro, Center of the Sea, and activates Throne of Eldraine, drawing 2 cards. After that, he casts a Temple Bell, which can be tapped to let each player draw a card, then moves to combat, attacking Richard for 21 with Multani, forcing him to block with the Courser of Kruphix, killing it but taking no damage. At the end of turn, Richard activates Yasmin to exile a Misty Rainforest from the top of his library. On Richard's turn, he draws 2 cards and then discards a card, before casting the Lost and the Damned, so whenever he plays a land or casts a spell from anywhere other than his hand, he makes a 3/3 spawn token. He then plays a Misty Rainforest from exile, making a spawn token and immediately sacrificing the land to lose a life, and search his library for a forest, putting it into play and making another spawn. This also triggers Cole's Archaeomancer's map, letting him put a Clifftop Retreat into play. We also remember that the Lost and the Damned triggers Luke's Zenith Chronicler, so each of Richard's opponents draws a card. Richard then activates Yasmin Khan to exile Mossfire Valley from the top of his library, and casts Worldly Tutor, searching his library for a creature, in this case Teferi Mage of Zhalfir, putting it on top of his library. On my turn, I draw 2 cards and discard a card, then I play a Plains and move to combat, attacking Cole for 2 with Inspiring Overseer, retaking the Coveted Jewel, untapping it, and drawing 3 cards. In my second main phase, I cast Combustible Gearhulk, having Richard choose to either let me draw 3 cards or mill 3 cards and do damage to him equal to the total mana cost of the milled cards. In this case, he chooses to let me draw 3. After that, I cast Norn's Decree, making any opponent who deals combat damage to me get a poison counter, and letting a player draw a card whenever they attack another player who has a poison counter. I also cast Cathar Commando, sacrificing it to destroy Lignify, and unfortunately I forgot that I had already gone to combat this turn, so I'm unable to attack, so I simply cast Mask of Avacyn and pass. On Cole's turn, he pays an energy to untap Aethertide Whale, giving it a trample counter, then draws 2 cards and discards a card. He casts Decoction Module, giving himself an energy whenever a creature enters under his control, and this also triggers Dr. Lee, giving him another energy. He also casts Liberty Prime, making 2 energy when it enters, and making him pay 2 energy when it attacks or blocks, or sacrificing it. This lets all of his opponents draw a card, then he moves to combat, attacking me with the Whale, Assaultron, and Liberty Prime, paying 2 energy for Liberty Prime and an energy for the Assaultron to put a +1/+1 counter on Liberty Prime as well. I block the Assaultron with my Gearhulk and Liberty Prime with Duke Ravengard, killing the Assaultron and Ravengard, taking 12 damage and giving control of the jewel to Cole, so he untaps it and draws 3 cards, plus he gets a poison counter. In his second main phase, he plays an Aether Hub, getting another energy, and casts Mechanized Production, enchanting Electrostatic Pummeler, so he makes a token copy of it in his upkeep, and winning the game if he controls 8 or more artifacts with the same name. At the end of turn, Luke activates Miko Koro and Temple Bell, making each player draw 2. On Luke's turn, he draws 2 cards and discards a card, then activates Temple Bell again, making each player draw another card. After that, he casts Last March of the Ents, drawing 36 cards since he controls a creature with 36 power, and putting any number of creature cards from his hand into play. In response, Richard activates Yasmin to exile Reliquary Tower from the top of his library, then the march resolves and ends with Luke putting into play Grothama the All-Devouring, Realm Seekers, which gets 72 +1/+1 counters since we all have 72 total cards in hand, Sage of Ancient Lore, drawing a card and getting power equal to 44 since Luke has 44 cards in hand, Nylea, God of the Hunt, giving all his creatures Trample, Bellowing Tangleworm, giving all green creatures Intimidate, Heartwood Storyteller, so whenever a player casts a non-creature spell, each of their opponents draws a card, Howling Golem, letting each player draw a card when it attacks, Brawn, Wood Elves, searching his library for a forest and putting into play, Morrow, and Bane of Progress, destroying all artifacts and enchantments, getting a +1/+1 counter for each one destroyed. Once all of that resolves, Luke casts Akroma's Memorial, giving all his creatures Flying, First Strike, Vigilance, Trample, Haste, and Protection from black and from red. He also casts Garruk Primal Hunter, but before moving to combat, Richard casts a Beast Within, destroying Akroma's Memorial and preventing most of Luke's creatures from attacking. He does, though, still attack Richard for 72 damage with Multani. Before blocks, however, Richard casts a Chaos Warp, making Luke shuffle Nylea back into his library and reveal the top card of his library, putting it into play if it's a permanent. In response, Luke casts Momentous Fall, sacrificing Morrow and drawing cards equal to its power, which is 30, and gaining life equal to its toughness, which is also 30. This leaves Luke with only 3 cards left in his library, giving him a 25% chance of putting Nylea back into play with the Chaos Warp, which he does, putting it back into play, keeping Trample, and knocking Richard out with lethal commander damage. On my turn, I play a mountain and recast my commander Duke Ulder Ravengard. When I go to combat, I target Agros Kos with Duke Ravengard's ability to give him haste and Myriad, paying 2 to copy it for all my other creatures. Then I attack Luke with my entire board, triggering Myriad and creating a token copy of all of them, also attacking Cole. This has me drawing a card, gaining a life, making 3 soldier tokens, and exiling Inspiring Overseer. Luke blocks as much as he can, killing my Captain of the Watch and only taking 3 damage, while Cole takes 21. At the end of combat, I exile all the Myriad tokens, and at the end of turn, Inspiring Overseer returns, drawing me a card and gaining me a life. Also at the end of turn, Cole activates Dr. Lee, paying 3 energy to draw a card. On Cole's turn, he casts Synth Infiltrator, entering as a copy of Realm Seekers with 77 +1/+1 counters. Then he casts Confiscation Coup, enchanting Sage of Ancient Lore, getting 4 energy and paying 5 energy to gain control of it since it has a mana value of 5. He activates Dr. Lee, paying an energy to give Realm Seekers +1/+0, Trample, and Haste, using it to attack Luke for 78. Luke blocks with his own Realm Seekers and Nylea, soaking up 38 of the damage and killing the original Realm Seeker, but still taking 40 damage. This isn't enough to stop Luke though, as he's able to simply untap on his turn and attack both Cole and I for more than enough with his board, knocking us both out and winning Luke the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game, and I mentioned it while we were actually playing the game, but I like that everyone's deck really kind of got to do exactly what they wanted to do. We made a huge board full of creatures, and we got to Myriad quite a few, and believe it or not, other than Luke, which his deck was designed to draw cards, we actually drew the most cards at the table for most of that game, which is pretty impressive considering we were a Boros deck going against a Temur deck, a Jeskai deck, and a mono green deck, so I'm pretty proud of how the deck performed, and we were very, very close to winning. I think one thing that I didn't consider when I was building this deck is how it's going to slowly get powered down as opponents are knocked out of the game. Going from making 2 Myriad tokens to 1 to not making any makes this deck very tricky, I think, in the late game. So if anyone has any suggestions for maybe ways to overcome that weakness, please do let me know. I would love to hear them. But overall, like I said, I did enjoy the deck. I thought it was a ton of fun. I'm very proud of how it performed. We just didn't quite get there in the end. With Richard's deck, his Top of the Library Matters deck, he also did pretty much what he wanted to do. He played a ton of cards from exile and just got very unlucky with the fact that Luke pointed his aggression toward him at the end. Granted, he tried really hard to prevent that with the Chaos Warp and getting rid of Nylea only to have Nylea come back from the Chaos Warp. So very, very cool showing by Richard's deck. Cole's deck also did very well. It was nice to see a lot of the pre-con cards that came in the deck put in a ton of work, as well as some of the other original energy cards, things like the Electrostatic Pummeler and the Aethertide Whale. It was super cool to see. I love energy as an archetype. I literally play it in Pioneer, so a huge fan of that deck, and I'm hoping we get to see it again in the future. And then finally, of course, we got to talk about our winner, Luke, getting a win with his mono green deck. He's tried many times to get a win with on the channel and finally got there. So very, very cool to see. I think the being able to draw a ton of cards and provide trample to his team is exactly what he needed to do. And he was lucky enough that a lot of attention was kind of focused elsewhere early in the game. People were very focused on me because we built up a board very, very quickly, and he was able to get some key pieces into play and kind of fly under the radar. But obviously that last big turn with the last March of the Ents really sealed the deal, being able to just take out Richard and put himself in such a commanding state that there wasn't much anyone else could do. So a very, very cool showing by the deck. Very impressed with it every single time it shows up. So let me know down in the comments what you thought of everyone's decks. Let me know if there were any clear favorites, if there's anything that you enjoyed. And of course, if there's anything you think we could add or maybe even remove from our deck in general. So thank you all so much for watching. Please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. But with all that being said, I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.